Evening. Welcome to week 6 of Intel 450, part 2 of our counterterrorism section. But before I talk about the videos that you were assigned, I want to talk about the papers. And I'll be honest, every one of you needs work. Most of the papers were barely on the satisfaction level. The biggest complaint I have is that you do not need all that background information. You do not need to go into 9/11 and all the rhetoric surrounding that. What I need you to do is go into your analysis. Just an example, one of these questions, and some of you did this, compare and contrast two terrorist groups. I don't need a history of two terrorist groups. That's not what I was asking for. What I was asking for was, what were their objectives? Were they successful? How were they successful? Did one group pursue a strategy that led to success? And did the other group pursue a strategy that led to failure? That's the depth I was looking for. And we've covered things like FLN, Irgun, Black September, that you should have had enough material on that. So, compare and contrast, be specific, and then provide your recommendations. Don't just leave me hanging. So that's probably my biggest frustration with the midterm. I hope to see improvement on the final, but for most of you, there's room to grow for your writing and your analysis. And then I'll also say is use the YouTube lectures. If you do not, I do these for a purpose. If I don't see them in the writing, you're not going to get a good grade. End of story. So view the YouTube lectures, cite them in your papers. That's why I do them. So shifting focus, counterterrorism policy. Last week we talked about high-value targeting. Today we're going to talk about some case studies, specifically 9/11. Saw the video on that, and then the underwear bomber, which you saw the BBC video on. So what are the policies that need to be implemented to actually mitigate these threats? So let's start with 9/11, and I want to pose this question, which is kind of on the discussion board. What were the intelligence failures? Why is 9/11 considered an intelligence failure? Other terrorist attacks happened. Oklahoma City happened. No one thought about that as an intelligence failure. So why 9/11? And personally, there's other recommendations for failure, but I see 3 intelligence failures. The first was a lack of ability to foresee a plane used as a weapon. And I will say, yes, we have hindsight on that, but the analysts and the aviation experts should have known that terrorists could hijack a plane and use it to crash into a building. The Bojinka plot, which you saw in your film, that was a plot to hijack planes and crash them into buildings. In 1994, the armed Islamic group hijacked a plane. Their intent was to crash into the Eiffel Tower, but luckily they were stopped by French commandos. So it wasn't unprecedented for someone to corral a plane and use it to crash into a building. And more importantly, it was very relatively easy to stop a plot. If you knew ahead of time that there was a potential that aircraft could be used as missiles, as they were on 9/11, it's not very hard to stop it. You can put federal air marshals on 10 to 15% of all flights. It's not that hard to do. You could reinforce cockpit doors, not even on all flights, on some of them. And that would make dropping or launching a 9/11 attack, that would make it impossible. You can do a background checks for anyone taking flight schools. Everyone who's applied for a job knows that you fill out an I-9, and you can't, without filling that out, you're not going to get a job. Well, you could put those same procedures in for anyone who wants to take flight training. They have to fill out an I-9. That would have uncovered some of the 9/11 hijackers. You could train crews to not be so passive if there's an attack like there was on 9/11. Those are all things that could have been done that are really inexpensive to do. But we didn't have the foresight. Now, I'm arguing we should have had the foresight, and it was relatively cheap to implement countermeasures. So that's Intel failure number 1, and that's the biggest one. The second Intel failure is kind of the lack of information sharing. And what I mean specifically is the CIA had people on their watch list that were known terrorists that were operated on, or that executed the 9/11 attacks. These were people that were known to the U.S. government, yet their information was, those names were never passed down to the FBI, or those names were never passed down to, at the time, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, or the airlines to say, stop these people from boarding planes. That's a pretty big intelligence failure. That's significant in my book. We've had apparatus now to rectify that. We have no-fly lists and other lists to try and merge that information together, but that was a big failure. And then the last failure, which I understand to an extent, if I was an analyst before 9/11, but the general consensus of the community was that a suicide bomber would not go through a year of flight training to execute their attack, meaning that a guy who and you saw Jarrah, one of the 9/11 attackers. He was a very well-to-do person. You saw him dancing in one of those videos. And he had a attractive girlfriend. And the model was that he would not be a suicide bomber. That suicide bombers were the poor, the mentally ill. They did not have the cognitive ability to go to flight training for a year and then conduct their attacks. That they were more like strap on and go. So that was kind of the third intelligence failure, that the community didn't see it in that way. So obviously, we can rectify this, but when I go into some of the policy failures, the one thing I want to emphasize is some of you have heard this line: we have to get it right every time. Terrorists just have to get it once. You have to get it right once. A lot of you have heard that line before. I'm here to tell you that I think that line is total stupidity. If anyone says that to you, smack them on the side of the head and say, no, that's not true. Because it excuses the intrusive natures of airlines, of what we see when you go to the airport and everyone gets strip searched, grandma gets strip searched, etc. And what it also forgets is that conducting a terrorist attack is pretty hard. It is not easy to do. In fact, terrorists have to get 10 things right in order for the attack to occur. And just to give you the 9/11 example, the things that a terrorist has to do to get it right. One, they needed freedom of movement in Afghanistan. At the time, they had ultimate freedom of movement to train, plan their attacks. Number two, they needed unrestricted access to the U.S. At the time, our visa immigration program was so screwed up that these guys can just walk in, basically just fill out a form and walk in with no cross-checks or no further scrutiny. The third thing that the terrorists needed was that they had unfettered access to flight simulators and training. Again, pre-9/11, they can just sign up for courses, whatever flight school, and pretty much go without suspicion. The fourth thing they needed was free access to the airline gate, meaning that there was no-fly lists, no further scrutiny when they got to the gates, no further checks to make sure there weren't knives in their bags. So they had that. Fifth thing, again, they needed access to the cockpit, which means that when they came in and they tried to take the plane down, there was no air marshal to stop them. There was no reinforced cockpit door to stop them. There was no attentive flight crew or passengers that could wrestle them to the ground. So that's the fifth thing they needed. And then the sixth thing is they needed free travel to their targets when they actually took control of the airline. But so they needed these things, and they got all these things. But if one of those things didn't happen, there would be no 9/11 attack. So from a counterterrorism perspective, I challenge everyone to look at it in that broad sweep. So these are the things that need to be happen. And from a counterterrorism perspective, how can I make it harder for one of those things to be a failure? The adage is, for those of you who play roulette, they have to spin the wheel 6 times and they got to get black 6 times. All right, if each one of these is a 50-50 chance. That's pretty hard for a terrorist to do. Some cases, maybe some of the things like freedom of movement, yeah, maybe he's a 90% chance of getting that. But when you add them all up, the probability for conducting an attack is very hard for them to do. So I just want to make sure that's clear. And that's kind of the key takeaway from the 9/11. If you haven't seen the video, watch it. And even if you have, I recommend you watch the video again and look at how the terrorists, the 9/11 hijackers, were able to use all of that, or to access, whether it's access to flight training, access to the airport, access to the cockpit, freedom of movement. Keep that in the back of your mind. So moving away from 9/11 to the underwear bomber, what was the intelligence failure? I think in the community there was a lack of belief that a suicide bomber would come onto a flight and detonate himself or herself in mid-flight. That was seen as a potential, but not really something that needed to be warned again. The other big intelligence failure, and the movie covers this in pretty good detail, is the terrorist, Muttalib in this case, did not make the no-fly list. Well, in fact, he did make it. Ironically, he made it in time he would have been stopped when he got to the airport, but he didn't get stopped before he boarded the flight. So we knew who he was. We knew he was a bad guy. We knew to arrest him as soon as he got into the country. But that information was 8 hours too late. It didn't get to the people at the gate. So those are the two big intelligence failures. But when we look at what he needed to do to accomplish his mission of downing a flight, again, similar to 9/11, he needed freedom of movement, which he had in Yemen. He had it all the time in the world to practice the bomb and get the bomb strapped to himself. He needed the acquisition of material, which AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, provided. He needed free transit to the U.S., which means that our visa immigrant system was actually pretty good. It was just 8 hours late, so he was able to board the flight without any issues, and that's the movie covers those in pretty good detail. He had to pass through airline security. Again, he was able to pass through it because there was no advanced screeners, no secondary screening for him. He was able to get a seat next to the window, and this is actually pretty critical when you think about this. If you want to blow up a plane, it's very hard to blow up a plane. They make it sound to be a little easier, but it's actually hard. If you put a bomb in the cargo part of a plane, very likely it'll blow up, might cause damage, might injure some people, but it probably won't down the plane. The one thing you need to do if you're a suicide bomber is you need to get right next to that fuselage and detonate yourself. You need to be at that on the window seat. So even if you're 2 or 3 seats in, the effect on the plane, and people have done assessments on this, is greatly negated. And you even saw yourself in the video where they tried to replicate it. They couldn't punch the fuselage, even with the guy right next to it. So the guy has to be right next to it. He's going to be over the wing where there's fuel to cook off the bomb. And he needs to mix he has to have the freedom of movement to mix the chemicals right, which is what went wrong, so they actually blow up. So they actually can, instead of fizzing out, there's an actual booster that detonates himself. And that's something that's hard to do when you're fiddling around, on seat 24, aisle E. And that's actually what caused him to fail. So again, you have to do all these things. Some of them are easy. I'll admit, if Yemen's a bad, easy place to acquire explosives, and it's probably pretty easy to get those explosives to a Europe or a point of departure that comes to the United States. It is very hard to actually down the aircraft. And what counterterrorism measures can we do to actually make it even more difficult? And that's the challenge. So, in conclusion, counterterrorism, when you have these things, look holistically. Break down what a terrorist needs to do and put the barriers up, multi-level, multi-layered barriers to make it hard for him or her to execute their plot. And again, the adage is he has to flip the coin 10 times, lands on heads all 10 times in order for them to execute their plot, especially if it's a lot more difficult. What can we do to make it even harder? So I appreciate it and look forward to your comments on the discussion board.